Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, everybody fell asleep after lunch is what I'm hearing. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, that's better, thank you. I'd like some interactivity so we can get a good show running. My name is Maarten Goet. I'm very excited to be here for the first time. I've presented a couple of sessions at various conferences around the world. I've never been to the Nordic Infrastructure Congress, so glad to be at NIC. And the session's called Effortless Migration from VMware to Microsoft Hyper-V 2012 R2. So we're going to look at some options on how to migrate. As far as myself, I'm based out of Amsterdam, Holland. I just flew in this morning. And I'm a System Center MVP and since a month also a Microsoft Regional Director. If you want to follow me on Twitter, that's my Twitter handle. And afterwards I'll post the slide deck, the videos and all the stuff you might be interested to you after the session. So again, thank you for attending and let's have a look at the agenda. So we did the welcome. I'll briefly touch on Hyper-V itself because I know Ben Armstrong is here. There's a couple of other guys that know a lot about Hyper-V. You've probably already had a lot of sessions, so I'm not going to bore you with what's Hyper-V and why it would be a better or a different choice as opposed to VMware. Now we're going to look at migration approaches. So once you had made the decision to go to the Hyper-V platform, you might be wondering, how do I get there? What options do I have? What are the things to consider when migrating to Hyper-V? And I'll tell you 6 ways. There's probably going to be more, but I'll tell you 6 ways within this hour. And as far as demos, I can't reach my lab from here, so I'll start using some videos. But at least you can see the demos I've prepared. That will be semi-live through the videos I'll be playing. And there's Q&A at the end. If you have any questions, I'll be hanging in the lounge afterwards as well. So when looking at Hyper-V, the most important message that Microsoft is bringing you is that Microsoft has a vision which has 3 pillars, where you can run virtualization on premises, which is Hyper-V as part of Windows Server, and it will be for a long time to come. Of course, there's Microsoft Azure, where they deliver the capability to run virtual machines in their public cloud offering, which essentially under the hoods also runs Hyper-V. And then there's the service provider scenario where a service provider can run virtual machines for you. And again, they could have Hyper-V running. And certainly all these providers that have Hyper-V running are now part of what they call the Cloud OS network. So with that, Microsoft has this common set of technologies, being Hyper-V, being the same disk type, being the same networking, etc., so that we can almost lift and shift the virtual machine from our on-premises to service provider to even a public cloud. And for Microsoft, this means they provide you choice, the choice to run things where you want at the price that you need, and certainly also with a common set of technologies, with a common manageability option, etc. So Microsoft calls this the Cloud OS vision, one consistent platform, Hyper-V running on premises today with 2012 R2, and then early next year, of course, in the next version. Now, again, we'll assume from this point on that we have chosen to go to Hyper-V. We might already have a dev test environment in place, want to build our production, want to move over the VMs that we have running in VMware, and we want to see how we would go about. Well, the first thing before we migrate, of course, is we need to know what we have. What VMs are running, how many VMs, how are they configured, what is their hardware profile, so for instance, CPU, memory, etc. So we need to assess our environment. And Microsoft gives you a tool called the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit, or MAP for short. It's been there for a lot of years already. It's been used in the past for Active Directory purposes, for Exchange, inventories, but certainly since version 5.6, we see that you can now also inventory your virtual world against, for instance, VMware. Now, the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit is an agentless way. So there's no need to install agents or other stuff on your servers. We will talk to things like Virtual Center. We will talk to the Windows OS through common technologies, and we will assess for you what is running. It provides these readiness assessments. So I said just now that it's also for other technologies, but we can assess for your Windows servers running virtualized in VMware as well. And it generates reports. So we can export to Excel, we can have a look at a PDF file, but we can also upload it and get an assessment, for instance, for the cost of running these VMs in Azure. Best of all, it's free. So it's a download on the Microsoft website. Currently, it's version 9 that's available, if I'm not mistaken. And you can use that running on an administrator workstation, or maybe if you're a consultant, you might have your own laptop and you want to connect to the environment for this customer and generate reports as part of preparing for the migration. So we choose within the tool the specific inventory scenario. In our case, that would be the virtualized network. And then we have to specify the credentials. So if you're inventorying against VMware, you need to have credentials, at least read-only, against Virtual Center or a specific ESX host for it to read that environment and, of course, produce a report. It can run as part of a one-time job, but you can also schedule it if you want to, for instance, see load on a certain virtual machine for CPU, for instance. You can have it run every hour, every night, whatever, at a certain period, let's say a month, so you get a better assessment of seasonality and, of course, the performance of the VM. Now, I guess these are 3 reports that might concern you when running map. One is the server consolidation report. It will give you a bit of information which servers might be combined or which VMs might be underutilized. We have the VMware discovery report. So we will just give you a raw list of all the VMs, of their properties, on which host they're running, by which virtual center they're managed, etc. And then a workload discovery, because probably you're concerned what's running in the VM. Is it a SQL server? Is it an Exchange server? Which version is it? And certainly if you want to go one step further from Hyper-V to Azure, you have to look at support policies at certain sizes for the VMs that you want to provision before it runs optimal in those environments. So the workload discovery will give you more a app discovery for things like SharePoint, SQL, Exchange, and of course some of these third parties as well. So let's assume we've run map, we have this raw data, we have some reports already configured, we know what we're going to migrate, and so the next step would be is what technology would we use to migrate? Because we can always run things or configure things the new way, but in our case we want to lift and shift a VM. Now these are 6 things to consider. We'll look at Virtual Machine Manager, which we all know and love, and you probably have in your environment anyway for managing Hyper-V. There's the Microsoft Virtual Machine Converter, MVMC, to consider. There's the Migration Automation Toolkit, MAT. There's Netapp Shift. I saw these guys have a booth on the expo floor as well, if you want to follow up later. And there's Vision Solutions, Double Take Move. And of course, Microsoft has released their own migration accelerator. The last one I won't show, just because of time purposes. We could probably spend a full hour on what can be done there, but I'll focus on these first gray 5 ones, and I'll explain the differences, the pros, the cons, and why you could choose one or another. So the first thing that we could consider is taking System Center Virtual Machine Manager. Again, because it's already sitting there, it does have a bit of a migration option to it. There's going to be a couple of pitfalls, but we could certainly look at this one to use for migrations. When we do so, we need to integrate System Center Virtual Machine Manager with VMware. It has the option to do so. It can connect to vCenter, it can connect to a specific ESX host, and it can from there on discover the environment, and from one single pane of glass we can both see the Hyper-V VMs and we can see the VMware VMs and start moving them around. Now these are some of the VMware operations you get when integrating with VMM. We can do placement, so when we're creating a VM, we can do intelligence placement like we do on the Hyper-V platform. We can initiate the vMotion, so like we do in vCenter, we can just coordinate what's happening in the platform and motion a VM around. We can create services. For those of you that have worked with VMM, you can create these services and you can deploy them on top of your VMware platform. We can create clouds, so we can bundle all this storage, CPU, and RAM capacity on the VMware platform to build a cloud for services to provide on. And we can do things like dynamic and power optimization. We have some PowerShell support, so automating tasks from VMM into the VMware platform. And we can set things like the ESX host into maintenance mode. And of course, all the regular stuff like start, stop, properties of a hardware profile, all these things you'd probably expect to get out of the integration anyway. Now, there's a couple of things that are of concern to you, and those are versions. Which VMware version are you running, and which VMM version am I running? You certainly want to get the latest and greatest as far as VMM, but as you see from the list, the support list goes up until 5.1 at the moment. So let's have a look at the demo. And again, this is a video because I'm unable to connect to my lab in Amsterdam, but this is the one I pre-recorded a while ago. In our environment, we have a VMware host for demo purposes. As you can see, it's one host with 6 VMs. And we have Virtual Machine Manager running 2012 R2. As you can see from the list, all the servers have already been connected. So we can go into things like the settings, and we can look at Fabric for servers, networking, and storage. Now, the first thing to do when integrating with VMware is we need to hook up the vCenter server. To do so, we will input the computer name. So we need to input the computer name, and we need to select a run as account. A run as account is the credentials, the username, password that I've already specified ahead of time that will be securely stored into VMM. And if we do so, it will integrate into VMM. And we've already done. So if we look at the infrastructure node and we go into vCenter server, you see that my vCenter 01 is responding. It's managing one host, and it's already configured into my VMM environment. The next step is to add the ESX service that I want to manage from VMM. So again, I need to specify a run as account, my credentials for connecting into ESX. And then the next, of course, would be to set up the host name which I'm using. We can select because vCenter knows which host it's using. And again, it's already been set up ahead of time. So ESX01 is successfully added, and you can see specific details on memory, etc. Now, if we go into VMs and services pane, these are the 6 VMs that correspond with the 6 VMs running on this specific host, right? So the same, we're in a consistent state. We get statuses like running, and we can do properties. We can do shutdown, power off, save state, etc. But when we go into properties, this would be essentially the same as doing from vCenter. So we can just have a look at the VM properties, the status, things like the hardware configuration. And again, because they're running, we can't change them now, but you could if they're stopped. And all the way down to things like disk adapters, etc. So this would be the same, and with this integration, we at least have one single pane of glass managing both the Hyper-V VMs as well as the VMware VMs that you see here. So that's the VMware migration. Now the next step would be is we want to take one of these VMs and migrate it from VMware to my Hyper-V hosts. And I have a couple of hosts standing by. So we would go to source 1, my first VM. Let's take that one. And we need to consider migrating it to our Hyper-V platform. So we right-click, and then we say migrate. We have the option to only migrate the storage, or we have the option to migrate the whole VM. And we'll select migrate the whole virtual machine, and it comes up with a wizard. As you can see now, we're not unable to select further because we need to first select the host where it will be migrated to. In our case, we'll select the O2 host, but then we still get a red cross, and the reason says the processor is not compatible. The real reason is it's still running. And when I have a running VM and I want to migrate, it needs to go into the same platform with the same processor. It would be the live migration it's trying to perform on a VMware VM, so we can't. So we need to shut it down first before we migrate this VM statically from the VMware environment into Hyper-V. And that's the first downside you'll experience migrating through VMM. We need to shut down the VM before it can take place. So we initiated a shutdown, and if you look at vCenter, it corresponds to what vCenter is seeing, and we now have a stopped state. So if we now go back into the VM and say migrate virtual machine, we still need to pick a host to migrate it to. We'll say, again, host 2. And now we do see a warning. But the warning is that we're going to convert from SCSI to IDE disks, and we can change that, but that's giving you a warning that it will convert. We need to specify the storage location within this new Hyper-V host where the VM will end up. So we will pick and choose the share that's already there. And then we need to map it to one of the networks that the new Hyper-V host knows about. So one of the logical switches. Maybe we want to select a certain port classification, a VLAN, so we can select those as part of the migration. And I only have one VM network, so that's mandatory. We'll hit next. We can do some properties like, do you want to turn off the virtual machine when the virtualization server starts, etc. So this is just basic stuff for migrating the VMware VM into Hyper-V. And maybe select to start it after deploying it. Now the other downside is this doesn't take care of things like VMware tools, deinstallation. Maybe you want to install the integration services as part of your new VM. So these are the things you need to handle yourself. If you go into the jobs window, this is where you see that Virtual Machine Manager is now migrating. It's copying files. It's starting the VM on the other side. So just plain and simple migrating the VM into Hyper-V. Now this would be your first way to go about. It's probably not the one that many people are going to use. We weren't able to change other settings. Maybe you want to shrink a disk, expand the disk. Maybe you want to change other properties in the VM. We need to deinstall VMware tools. There's going to be downtime while copying the files over. If it's a big VM, it's going to take a while. So the VMM way is certainly one that's supported and certainly one that's free and available to you. But you probably want to have a look further at an option. One of them could be the Microsoft Virtual Machine Converter, MVMC. It says 2.0. I think we're already in 3.0 at the moment, but at least to give you a story of what's there. This is a Microsoft-supported solution. I think that's the key thing to take away, because we want to be migrating in a supported way. It's a free tool. Again, we can take it from the Microsoft.com download site and download MVMC and use that as a standalone mechanism to migrate your VMs from VMware to Hyper-V. Again, it could be an administrator workstation, could be as a consultant that has MVMC installed and will connect into this environment to migrate. It's quick and easy. You download the MSI, you install it, and then when running the tool, you connect into the environment, you select the virtual machine that you want to migrate, which could be a 2008, a 2012, a 2003, or 2012 R2 VM. And the great thing is it's scriptable. So MVMC does allow you to use this UI, but if you want to go ahead, it has a way to script about it. And all the OSs that are supported by Microsoft today are supported by MVMC. Now it's real easy. We select the source, we select the VM to convert. Again, it will copy files. We will select the destination, and it will then start conversion. We have a support list also on the VMware side of things it can do and cannot do. So we do have things like VMDK support, single multi-extent IDE, SCSI support, vSphere, and with 3.0 we can now also do 5.5 for those of you running 5.5. So this sheet hasn't been updated, but we can do so now. What's new, it doesn't only allow you to migrate into Hyper-V, it also allows you to migrate into Azure. So if we want to migrate off of VMware directly into Azure, we can. Or if we have a Hyper-V VM, we can take that VM and we can migrate that into Azure as well. The new version supports PowerShell support. So V1 supported running it as a command line. Now we have PowerShell support for embedding into your scripts. We have the support for offline virtual machines. So again, it's going to be the same scenario with VMM. We need to have the VM stopped before we can run this conversion. So it's going to cause downtime. That's an important key takeaway. Support for 5.5. I apparently noted it in this sheet correctly. And support for all the major OS versions. So let's have a look. Again, it's the same environment. So we have the same Hyper-V and VMware source installed. This is an administrator VM, and I've installed MVMC. And this is where you see I have two options: migrate to Windows Azure, or Microsoft Azure today, or migrate to Hyper-V, and we'll use that option. All right, gives you a bit of info that we need to enable WMI on the source VM. We then take the virtual machine, or the Hyper-V host to migrate to, so that would be the O2 again. And then username password for connecting. Well, I'm connected as an administrator to this. We need to have an interim path. So I'm copying the VM files. I need to have a path to store them, and then we'll copy them to the Hyper-V host. It's not direct. So we need to make sure this workstation where we're storing it now, or a share like I'm doing, will have sufficient space. Choose the type of disk for the destination, so dynamically expanding, and then connect the source server, so the vCenter server. We can connect to ESX directly, but we'll take the vCenter server. Again, username, password, and then we should get a list of the virtual machines on that environment. Should be 6, right? And then the sysprop template. So one has already been migrated, or we're trying to migrate through VMM. So we'll take source 2, use this Windows user account, final state of the virtual machine of the source, and final state of the virtual machine destination. We'll both put them in off. There we go. It validates credentials. This is the disk path for storing the temporary files for the converted disks. So our E drive. Again, the speed of the migration will then depend on the speed of the disk. If it's a big VM and we're converting it and we're using this local disk, then you need to make sure it's fast if you want to have a speedy conversion. And then we'll finish it up. And it starts. So the good thing there, easy wizard. The other benefit is it does take care of things like VMware tools, deinstallation, integration services check. Does a couple of other things to tidy it up and make sure it migrates over well. And it's easy if you don't have VMM, or again, you're a consultant, you're doing this for a customer of yours. MVMC is a proper way to go about. It will create a snapshot before time. So if you want to go back, something went wrong, whatever, we can take the snapshot on the VMware environment. This is where you see the snapshot's been taken. So we always have a fail-safe if we want to go back. I would say the downtime, or the downside is that we need to do one VM at a time. What if we want to do 100 or 100 plus? This is going to be tedious because we need to run the wizard 100 times. That's probably not the way to go about. Maybe the user doesn't have the admin credentials. You need to get them safely. Again, there's going to be downsides and also pros to this solution. One of the things that was done is that Microsoft also provides a migration automation toolkit, MAT. This means that it will take the MVMC, use its PowerShell function to automate this migration for a large number of VMs. So I can specify 100. This PowerShell script will take MVMC, take all the parameters you've input, and then it will go about migrating all these hundreds. And you can configure things like 5 at a time, maybe if one fails, stop the whole migration, etc. So the MAT allows you to do MVMC in bulk. Again, this is a supported solution. That's the great news. So if you want to use MVMC, you can have a look at MAT. It's still a supported solution. And the set itself, so the script, etc., is published to the Microsoft TechNet Gallery. And you can take that, maybe build some extra logic in there for your own company and run with it. Now, the things that apply to MVMC will apply to MAT, because we're just running MVMC under the hoods. So we do need temporary storage. If you want to do 100 VMs and you're doing 50 concurrent, which I probably wouldn't recommend, you want to have big and good and fast storage for the intermediate files. You want to have a fast workstation where you're running this from, because it will do a lot of the processor power for converting stuff. So you have to look at if this works for your environment. And there's a couple of other things you need, like a SQL Express version for it to maintain where it's at in the migration. But MAT, in essence, looks like this. Step 1 is collecting the stuff from vSphere. 2, it would give you a list that you can then manipulate and to say which ones do I want to migrate and which follow up, and then convert it, and of course push it into Hyper-V and scale your deployment. So free to use. If you know MVMC, it's easy because it's already automated for you. It's PowerShell driven. It needs a bit of SQL Express to work. Multiple concurrent conversions really depends on how powerful your server is, the storage, etc., how much you can run. It scales horizontally, of course. If you want to have multiple MAT servers, that's fine by us, so you can use that. It's extendable, customizable, it's just PowerShell, so if you have skills there, you can just run with the script. And of course, reporting. So is it running? Is it successfully converted? Where is it in the stages? Has it failed, etc.? And again, very, very important, it's supported. So if you have a question, you run into problems, you can still contact Microsoft support and get decent supportability on this solution. So we talked about MAT, we talked about MVMC, and then I stood still by the fact that there's temporary storage. And temporary storage could be a big storage facility you need. Maybe it needs to be very fast. Maybe you don't have temporary storage. And maybe the good news is you have Netapp. And some will, some don't. If you do have Netapp, there is a project called Shift, which allows you to do speedy migrations of your VMs that run on VMware that need to go to Hyper-V, but they also run the other way around, so from Hyper-V to VMware. It's supported if you have version 8 dot something of that operating system, and if you have the cluster mode license. So the project itself is free, but you probably already spent quite a bit of money on Netapp itself. So what does Netapp Shift do? It takes MAT. So it takes MVMC in essence. So it does, in essence, the same thing as we just talked about in the last 20 minutes. What it does differently is for the temporary storage, it intelligently talks into the Netapp filer. And it will tell it not to just write blocks, it will tell it that it needs to change blocks. So we will take the VMDK file. Internally, it will do some magic for reworking the blocks and the way it's organized, and it will produce a VHD or VHDX file. It will do that almost instantaneous because it's all done on the filer. It's almost shifting pointers in the files. It's not really copying files. It's just doing some magic that Netapp can do on their filer. So we take the MAT solution. Netapp Shift is another layer where it will just intelligently talk to the Netapp filers. And it's actually great. Certainly if you want to have a cutover migration in the weekend, maybe you have a couple of hours to get a couple of VMs converted, maybe they're big SQL servers, for instance, then we can have a look at Netapp Shift. Again, a demo. So in this environment, it's a bit bigger, roughly 30 VMs running here on a single ESX host. And there's also this Hyper-V host that's standing by. And then there's the project shift file, which is in essence just a PowerShell file that will connect, like MAT does, into the environment. So we've set it up. We're now running the PowerShell file. It's saying in the left top, it's connecting to ESX, it's connecting to the Netapp filer, it's getting all the VMs. We've prepared the list of the 30 VMs. And what you'll see on the screen is it will give me a pop-up if I don't specify anything else. for us to select the VMs that we want to migrate, and we'll go ahead and select all of them. They all have 2 gigs of memory, all a 30 gigabyte disk, and it will now start almost instantaneously push the VMs, convert them from VMDK to VHDX, and then in the Hyper-V manager, probably you'll see them appearing second after second. So it says in Mountain VHDX, there we go, convert, 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 and it starts running. So almost instantaneous. Even for bigger VMs, it's just because on the storage layer, shifting pointers, doing some of their filer magic, there's no copying of files going around. And this allows you to convert. If you want to go back, again, snapshots have been made. We can roll back, we can convert them into VMware. And of course, we need to be reasonable about it. If we're running on the same network, if we've specified both to become running, that we might have a problem. So we need to consider what we're doing here. But if you're doing bulk migrations, big VMs, you don't have temporary storage, you do have a Netapp license for cluster mode, then Netapp Shift could be a perfect way to migrate. This would be something to talk about, I guess, with the Netapp guys over at the Explore floor, if you're more interested in this. This is, of course, what we have here. Just anything else. Now, this is, again, a great solution. But you might not have NetApp storage, I consider that for sure. And maybe you want to be even more specific about a migration. Maybe want to remap network adapters. Maybe want to redo IP addresses. Maybe want to shrink disks. Maybe I want to convert them, test it. If it works, run it on VMware for a while, and then do the definitive migration the weekend after. Maybe you have advanced scenarios that you want to work with. One of the paid for options, this certainly is not free, is double take move. If you're gonna move from VMware to Hyper-V, there's gonna be a couple of vendors, NetIQ, double take, etc. Double take move is, in my opinion, one of the better. You pay a couple of dollars per VM, and then you can migrate one time from VMware to Hyper-V. If you want to use it for disaster recovery purposes, for instance, going from VMware to Hyper-V as part of a disaster recovery, it can do so as well. You'll just pay more for the license. So it allows you to migrate not only from VMware to Hyper-V, but also from physical servers to another world. And you see the dotted lines, we can go from physical to physical, physical to virtual, physical to cloud, virtual to physical, virtual to virtual, etc., etc., etc. So it allows for a lot of options. It does all the migration conversions for you in the backend. So how does it work? It does not work on host level. It will not talk to the ESX host nor to the Hyper-V host. It will be in the VM. So it will be talking to your operating system, whether it's Linux or Windows, and it will do so on the destination side as well. So it's on the VM level that it allows for you to migrate. I think that's a pro and a con. Sometimes you only have host access. Sometimes you want to be more advanced, then certainly the OS way will allow you to be way more advanced. So it will install a certain driver, a certain package in the source VM, as well as in the destination VM. Because it needs to connect, it needs to do some magic, it needs their own infrastructure, in essence, their own Windows service and agent to run. So we've set that up. In this graphic, you see a host on the left, a host on the right. There's a VM running in there. And initially, it copies all the data within the source VM into the destination VM. So anything on disk, anything on memory, it will just copy over to the destination VM. The next is where it has this double take I/O driver, and it's a system operating driver that you get, for instance, for Windows Server. And now every time that something gets written to disk on the source VM, it will capture that and say, oh, I now know that you've written something that I need to replicate over to the other side. So it starts to replicate that for you. It maintains a disk map, if you will. It will maintain a memory map and will make sure that these are synchronous. Now, there might be a lag. If it's a data center between London and New York, there might be a second in between. There might be other reasons like outage, and it certainly can prevent that as well, because it will have caching, so you can still work on the source VM. It will note which blocks need to be replicated when I have contact again, and it will replicate afterwards as well. Now there will be a disk queue on disk then, so by default it's 100 meg. If you need more, you need more. And certainly outage is not the way to go, but it can recover from outage. Once we have a connection again or latency approves, it will mirror the VM and make sure it's synchronous. This is also the way it will do the disaster recovery. So let's have a look at double take move. And it's called move because it's the one-time only option where we move from, in this case, VMware to Hyper-V. Again, we need to have software installed on our administrator workstation or a consultant workstation, which will run the jobs for you. So this is the double take console. And what we're going to do next is add the servers that we want to migrate or maintain. Now, servers in this case is another word for VMs. So we want to add the VMs that we want to migrate to. And then we can have a look at the jobs, much as like in VMM. If we specify a replication job, we can see it here as far as status. If we want to do a migration, we can see how far it is, has come along. So we'll say add a server, VMware source 4, one of the 6 VMs, administrator. We'll have password, of course, for you. The domain, add, and we'll say OK. What now happens is that there's also a way to do automatic discovery for it to go into Active Directory, get the computer accounts. What now happens is that it will check if it has the double take driver or agent installed. It now says cannot connect to management server. Another way of saying I don't have the agent installed. So the next thing to do is hit install, and it will push the package to your VM. If it does so, you need to be aware that it requires .NET Framework 3. So not everybody wants that. Maybe some server won't allow for it, but it will need to install .NET Framework first. It will try and do, and you can specify also a path where it can be found. Then we need a code, which is in essence a license for a one-time migration from VMware and Hyper-V. And then we say the installation options, so the double take driver, the installation queue folder, unlimited disk queue, couple of options you want to specify for double take, and maybe install it now or later, and last but not least, whether or not you allow an automatic reboot, because .NET might ask you for a reboot on certain servers. So it's executing the installer. That will probably on a fast VM just take a couple of minutes or maybe even under a minute. And once the agent is running, it can talk natively to the VM and starts doing its migration work. So we have one set up, as you can see here, VMware source 5, so the 5th VM we have, has already been set up. We've installed the agent, and we already have the migration job in place to migrate the 5th VM to Hyper-V 02. And it says protecting healthy, which means I'm replicating data and memory at the moment. And now when I go into Hyper-V Manager for the second host, we see that we now have a source 5 underscore replica, much like with Hyper-V replica, where the VM is being replicated. It's off. The source VM is running. This one is off, so it's just doing the data transfer into the disks. So that should already be there. Let's have a look. And we can do the failover and cutover migration. Much like with Hyper-V itself, we can fail over the data. In essence, it would finish the copy, stop the source VM, start the destination VM, not connected to a network, so it can just be tested. And then we can have a try out if the migration has been successful. So from this console, like you do with Hyper-V replica, we can migrate and test the failover first. So what we'll do is we'll go into the VM. So source 5 actually has running SQL Server. And this is the VM that's running. And in SQL Server, we'll have a database. And to show you that it's instantaneous, that we can mirror the data while it's occurring. We'll run a script to create a table, create a record, look at the timestamp, and see whether or not it's replicating it live to the destination VM. So this is where we start SQL Server Management Studio and connecting to the SQL Server environment. Here we go. We'll connect to our SQL Server. That is called Source 5 because it's running in the VM. Here we go. And then we'll create a database. Yeah, no database is available yet, so it's a brand new SQL Server. I've created a T-SQL script that will create the database, will create the table, and create a record called the magic query. Then we'll open it up in Management Studio. And the database is called TagAdd because last time I presented this one on TagAdd, so it's called TagAdd 2014, TagAdd 2014 log file. The database will be called TagAdd 2014, and it will create a timestamp of when I created the video recording, of course. So we'll go ahead and execute this script. So it will create the database. And again, this VM is protected, so at the same time it should be creating the database and the stuff on the other side. So May 9th, just under 6 p.m. is when the timestamp was. And after doing the migration, we should actually see, even though the VM was off, that when we bring the VM back up on the Hyper-V side, it should show us, of course, this database and this timestamp. So we'll say, we'll do a test failover instead of a migration. And the test failover will not connect it to a network, of course. So it says failing over. Go into manage servers. So it's starting the failover. Failing over, depending on your environment, could take a couple of seconds, maybe a minute. So we'll speed this up, otherwise we're going to wait too long. We'll go here. So if we want to, we're not going to wait for the test failover to occur. We're going to go through the wizards on how the migration is set up. So we're back in the DoubleTake console, and we want to set up a protected VM. We can protect the physical server, as we saw. We can protect the virtual server on VMware, and we can protect Linux and Windows servers as well. So 5 has already been protected. 4 is where we installed the agent on. We'll select 4, hit next, choose that one as the source VM. Want to select either the full server, maybe just a single disk or a folder. I want to do a full server to Hyper-V replication. And then the rules is where it really gets advanced. So if you say, I want to convert this workload, but I don't want to, for instance, bring the page file, because that's only something that is specific for this environment. I can exclude files, I can include files, I can set up a certain rule. So this is already more advanced than we've seen with MVMC. Of course, we can select the destination server. So we'll say Hyper-V host 2. It will create a blank VM and start replicating into Hyper-V host 2. And then we have options for protecting the data. So we've selected the VM and the data. And then we can say what will be the virtual machine location for the destination. We can give it a job name, where the replica will be stored on the new Hyper-V server. We can configure virtual machine settings. So we'll take this path where our cluster storage resides. Then give that as the destination path. Here we go. And then we can have a look at the virtual machine configuration. So the display name of the VM. From here we can also change the number of processors. It was 4, but we can change it to whatever quantity we need. Same goes, for instance, for memory. So we can select how the target VM should look like. Other things like the network, we've seen that in VMM as well. Now volumes is interesting because maybe you want to shrink or expand the disk. So here you see it's 40 gigs, but only 10 gigs is in use. And I can change it to a certain size and change it to either fixed or dynamic. And the storage controller that's associated. So great way of being able to also support a major OS upgrade afterwards if you want to expand the disk. We can have a look at the network adapter. So this is in the operating system where we say this network adapter now will be refitted to a new IP address with a certain subnet mask. You can set the gateways, the DNS servers, etc. But we'll leave it as is. And we have other options we can configure as well. So for instance, we can have a look at the network route. This will be which network adapter will double take use to replicate this data. Maybe you have a specific cluster network. Maybe we'll set up a specific network for migrations. So we can select that. And then compression. So great thing as well, if you're going through certain cities, longer routes, we can enable compression. And we can also limit bandwidth, so we're not pushing out any other apps that may use that line. So, and we can do schedule limits, maybe just overnight, where we want to mirror stuff. But again, then we'll have queues on the source VM. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with setting up the protection and migration job. This will be running until we say migrate. Then it will be done, of course. If you want to continue protecting VMs, then you need the high availability license. So it checks, pre-flight check, says summary, and it will then start protecting. Now, mind you, this job is run from this double take console. This double take console has been installed on this VM. If I lose this VM, I lose my protection. So I need to have a designated server that will actually mirror stuff, run the jobs for you, etc. So here it says failed over, I'm sorry. So what that means is the source 5 is now running on the Hyper-V host, but without a network. And of course, what we should get is that SQL Server is configured in there, the database is there with the current timestamp, because that would mean that we have correctly been mirroring stuff. Here we see the source 5 replica again running. We go into settings just to show you that network is not connected. So here we have the network adapter that's not connected. In a migration scenario, it would of course be connected and it would shut down the original VM. So we'll leave that for now, otherwise we'll be in a world of hurt. And then we can connect through the console connection to double check if SQL is still there and if the timestamp made it. So we'll say connect. Here we go. This is the same source 5, but because it's not connected, it's gonna do a cached login into the VM, where we should still be able to get in. We'll say administrator, our password, and I'll fast forward it for you guys so we don't need to wait. Go into SQL Management Studio. Probably here we go. And just quickly check if the database is there and it's been replicated nicely. Source 5, databases, tag at 2014, the table, and the timestamp should say just under 6 p.m., 17:51 or something. So there we go. And it does. So same timestamp, same record, SQL's been replicated, data in the VM has been replicated. So it's a good way to have consistency throughout these VM migrations. So this is double take move. Double take move is also part of a Microsoft-sponsored program. So if you're going to move to Hyper-V and you're talking to your Microsoft representative to set up your environment, maybe get some sponsorship money to get that done, there's special licensing that Microsoft provides through a program that will allow you to buy double-tick move at a cheaper price than you have when you go to their store. Just as an FYI, I certainly don't have any stock in the company, but just want to give you a bit of a discount that you know about. So these are options you have. Microsoft has its own migration accelerator, which you can also look at. I've not prepared, but you can look at that. If you have any questions, love to answer them afterwards. And well, thank you for attending, and thank you for having me at NIC. Good luck with your migrations.